Hi pals, and welcome to a new video. As we're all putting together our end of the year reading list, today I thought I'd do something a little bit different and talk about some of the reading lessons I've learned over 2025. I have five lessons that 2025 has taught me about reading and books. These definitely aren't rules, they're more kind of shifts in terms of how I approach my reading life, buying books, and kind of the reading experience. Let's go ahead and get started. First up, it is to add the books you want to buy to a list and then forget about that list for a little while. This very simple, very basic method has saved me so much money when it comes to impulse buying books. I have been keeping this ongoing list of the books I want to buy for, I'd say, well over a year. It lives on the reminders app on my phone. You probably can't see that, but I literally have a list that is called books. It currently has 58 books on it. Whenever I spot a book that I want to buy, whether that is watching a review on a YouTube video, wandering around Waterstones, or it gets mentioned on a podcast or in a review, instead of immediately going to buy it, I add it to my list and I let it sit in that list for a fair old while. I know for some people their list of books they want is their Amazon wish list, or maybe they have them stored on Goodreads. I've found for this to work, you have to keep on top of your list so it can't sprawl to the thousands of books. It has to stay at a manageable level. What I also do with mine as well is check in with it quite regularly and reprioritize books that I really do want to get a hold of and have wanted to read for quite a while. And any ones that were kind of more impulsive, one of the habits that I have is I really love when people are enthusiastic about things, and I very often get drawn into that, especially on BookTube. But having them on a list, leaving it for like a few days or a week or two, really, I can then really reassess, do I actually want to read that? Is it to my taste? Will I get to it soon? So I go back into my list, I remove stuff that were just kind of more like impulsive or kind of in the moment, and I reprioritize stuff that I do really want to get hold of. So that's very important. I also find this really practical, especially around this time of the year, around birthdays, when people ask you what you want. Instead of kind of panic buying stuff when you're in like a Waterstones or you've gone book shopping, you can just pull up a list and see whether they have the books that you've wanted for quite a long time. But most of the books I want to buy now live on this list for a good few weeks, if not months, before I actually buy them. It also helps me be much more kind of picky about the editions of the book that I want to track down as well. One of the things that I have done in the past is overbuy kind of new literary fiction in hardback. They're very expensive, and they can really start to add up over time, especially when it turns out that you've read the book and it really wasn't for you, or it just stays on like a to be read shelf and then you kind of like donate it. That's a very expensive hobby, and one that generally I try to avoid. I've been using this for, like I said, well over a year, and I find it so helpful. Lesson 2 is one that was really hammered home by two books that I read this year, and that is that certain books have their own pace. And I learnt this through reading American Pastoral by Philip Roth and Parade's End by Ford Madox Ford, two of my favourite reads of the year. I took American Pastoral on holiday with me when I went to Spain in June. I took a massive stack of books away on holiday with me and didn't get through that many of them, I would say. That's because I found this quite an intense read and I couldn't rattle through it like I kind of assumed I would be able to. It required a lot of breathing space between chapters, between passages, and a lot of time to sit and reflect. Parade's End was very similar. I had assumed I would read that over the course of a month as I was reading other things alongside with it. It actually took me almost 3 months to get through it. It's an incredibly dense kind of like modernist work, and when you're not concentrating on it completely, you can lose the thread of what is happening. So being able to concentrate on it, being able to sit down and kind of tease out all the things that are unsaid that are actually incredibly important are kind of completely necessary to reading Parade's End. You do, I think, very often come to books that have their own pace, whether that is a quicker a crime novel or a thriller that has a quicker pace, or whether that is a book that has a much more kind of a slower pace and is more demanding. And ignoring that really only ever does yourself a disservice. And books having their own pace is very similar to another lesson that I have kind of come to the conclusion on, and that is that some books, when you finish them, demand you sit with them and reflect on them before you start anything else. Like some classics like George Eliot, some Dickens, you can't finish them and then pick up something straight away immediately. They require kind of days or weeks potentially, I guess, depending on the reader, of time to really kind of let things settle so that you can kind of retain the information in the book in your head. One of the things that I do notice when you watch a lot of booktube videos is that people really do kind of like rattle through books, but that they struggle to kind of retain that information. It's very hard to kind of retain details when you start books kind of like one after the other. It will probably mean that you read less, but I don't think it really matters in the long run. Right, we're on to lesson 3. One of the biggest kind of pros to reading for me in the past maybe like 2 or 3 years is that reading is really an escape from the absolutely terrible news cycle that we all live in. By that I mean kind of, you know, a break from kind of world events, a break from how angry people are, the kind of like toxic like culture that we have online. Reading is really an antidote to both of those things. And the lesson that I've taken from this year is that I have 2 best methods for that: joyful reading and reading incredibly long, rambly books. Let's go to joyful reading first. Over the past year, I have really embraced reading for joy and comfort. I do like tackling the big classics, but I find it's not possible when you're balancing reading with like work and like a social life and everything else to always read that way. Sometimes you just don't have the like capacity, and that's where I think joyful reading as a balance to those kind of denser, kind of more tricky works can be such a joy. But it's also the perfect antidote to things just feeling a little bit grim. However, I'm not somebody who really reads a lot of things you'd associate with the more kind of escapist quick reads like fantasy or romance. I do still like my comfort reads to have a little bit of something to them. So when I say like joyful reading, I mean like a P.G. Wodehouse, a Barbara Pym, an E.F. Benson, who has been one of my favourite discoveries of the year. Elizabeth Von Arnim as an example, a lot of Persephone classics, classic crime. Those are really my comfort reads, and this year has been the year when I've really embraced those things. Earlier this year, I was listening to a radio for, I think it was like an episode of Goodreads, and it had Giles Brandreth on it, who I like a lot. He was talking about the E.F. Benson Map and Lucia novels, which is the reason why I was listening. And he described them as like intelligent comfort reading, and that label has really stuck with me. I also very often describe them as kind of hot water bottle novels. They're essentially the same things that do have like an integrity to them. They're written very well, but they're an absolute joy. I can always tell I have one of these when I look forward all day to reading them in bed. That's when when I'm reading an Agatha Christie or Barbara Pym, that will be like the most exciting thing that I have to do that day, because I just love them so much. And the second part of this is reading longer novels. And by that I mean 800 pages plus. For this you'll probably need a Victorian, Dickens being the master of the long, rambly novel with kind of 50 characters in. That's kind of really what I'm thinking of here. I really do think that these are a great kind of antidote to the world feeling a little bit grim. Some of my favourite reads this year have been longer novels. My favourite maybe, well, I'm gonna do a kind of favourites of the year, but one of my favourites has been Our Mutual Friend. I also think that classics, whether they be long or short, Victorian classics, early 20th century classics, give you an absolutely brilliant sense of perspective. That is kind of two ways to kind of remove myself from consuming too much news: joyful reading and also long novels. The fourth lesson that I learned over 2025 is that culling books, unhauling them in booktube parlance, can be very therapeutic. In April I moved house and I culled around 500 books. I used to have 9 of the really big bookcases, now I have 6, and it was such a cathartic experience. My reading tastes over the past few years have really shifted back to reading mainly kind of modern classics and classics, and I had hundreds of books that I was only kind of lukewarm on when I read them the first time, or even books that I enjoyed but I knew for a fact I would never read again. There's nothing like a house move to make you sit and reflect on whether it's worth packing, moving and then unpacking a book. So I did a huge cull, and it was actually really freeing. I freed up space physically, obviously, but also mentally. It is a really weird thing to look at your book collection and see like book on book on book that don't actually reflect where you are as a reader at all. And so getting rid of those was just like actually like a really wonderful experience. And most of those books have probably gone to like better homes for people who will read them, which I think is fantastic. So that is lesson 4. Sometimes a good sort through can be exactly what you need. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see on camera, but my cat has joined us for lesson 5, which is Poetry Makes Life More Beautiful. This year, I have made a concerted effort to read more poetry. I really started doing this in kind of late spring, and it has been such a wonderful experience. I've gone back to reading more kind of Victorian and 20th century poetry, and it's been such a joy. As an example, yesterday I read T.S. Eliot's The Ariel poems. These are his poems for Christmas that were written in the 1920s and 1930s. They were written to be on like greetings cards that Faber and Faber produced. They also come with original illustrations. This is such a lovely addition. I don't think that this is in print anymore. It's such a shame because the poems in here are absolutely wonderful, and he writes in this that a good poem really does transcend seasons, so you can read them all year round. I was just kind of doing bits and bobs yesterday. I'd finished doing my jigsaw for the day, which I always do over Christmas, and I kind of sat down to read this. Didn't take long at all because it's really not a long collection, and it was like the highlight of what I did that day because the poems were so beautiful. That has been a kind of familiar experience kind of throughout the latter half of this year. I'd really love to take that into next year and kind of crack on with my poetry. It's one of those things that when you stop doing things by degrees, I guess, you don't really realise what you're missing until you rediscover it. Right, my cat is gone, and that is it for today's video. I hope you all have a lovely, peaceful Christmas, and I will see you all next week for my reading favourites of the year. Merry Christmas and goodbye for now.